In 1892, federal agents on the San Carlos Apache Reservation made a horrific discovery. They found a young girl, just 8 years old, buried in the desert sand with only her head exposed to the blazing sun. The most shocking detail was that she was still alive. Her heart was beating, yet her skin had already started to dry and harden, beginning the mummification process while she still clung to life. This was not a random act of cruelty or a freak accident of nature. It was the result of a deliberate and ancient practice, a brutal tradition with deep roots in the history of the American Southwest. But this child's ordeal was just the final, tragic chapter in a story that spans centuries. A story that includes calculated justice, spiritual sacrifice, and a punishment so complete it tried to erase a soul. The American Southwest possesses a unique ability to preserve the dead. The combination of extreme heat, very dry air, and certain types of sand creates perfect conditions for natural mummification. A specific kind of sand, called diatomaceous earth, is especially powerful. This fine, powder-like sand acts like a sponge, pulling moisture out of anything it touches. Normally, this process happens slowly to a body after death, resulting in the leathery mummies we see in museums. The desert air slowly wicks the moisture away over weeks from a corpse that feels nothing. But what certain ancestral Pueblo, Fremont, and Mojave tribes mastered was a terrifying leap in understanding. They learned how to use the desert not to preserve the dead, but to create the dead, by starting the process on a living, conscious human being. The method was a calculated and slow process. It began with the digging of a hole, approximately 3 feet deep, in a patch of dry, diatomaceous sand known for its extreme absorbency. The convicted or accused individual was then made to stand in this pit. The sand was shoveled back in, packed tightly around their body from the feet all the way up to the neck. This created a snug, inescapable cocoon. Their arms were typically pinned at their sides. No ropes or physical restraints were needed. The weight and pressure of the densely packed sand itself acted as a perfect prison. Only the person's head remained above the ground, completely exposed to the elements, sun, and wind, while the rest of their body was trapped in the moisture-wicking earth. And then the tribe would leave. But what happened next over the following days was a physiological nightmare, meticulously reconstructed from archaeological findings, and one particularly horrifying university study. According to a 1994 University of Nevada study that analyzed preserved remains, the death was a slow and conscious ordeal. For the first day, the victim remained fully aware, suffering from extreme thirst but able to see, hear, and even speak. By the second day, their body would enter severe dehydration. The tongue would swell, and lips would crack and bleed. The study found damage in the throat consistent with repeated swallowing attempts, proving the victim was still conscious and feeling the desperate need to drink. After several days, speech would become impossible, but awareness remained. Death typically arrived around day 4 to 7 from cardiac arrest, but by then, the mummification process was already advanced. The person was essentially drying out from the inside while their mind was still active. This sounds like the ultimate torture. But for the cultures that practiced it, this wasn't about inflicting pain for pain's sake. In fact, some believed it was a more merciful form of justice than a quick and bloody death. And the reason why will challenge everything you think you know about mercy. Within these tribal justice systems, this practice was not officially viewed as torture, but as a form of exile. The philosophy was that the desert itself would act as the judge and jury. The community was not directly responsible for the death. They were merely leaving the person's fate to the land and the spirits. If a miracle occurred, if a rare rainstorm flooded the area, if the person managed to free themselves, or if an animal dug them out, it was seen as a clear sign of divine intervention. Their survival meant their guilt was absolved, and they could return to the tribe. However, historical accounts show that this survival was incredibly rare, happening only a handful of times over centuries. This concept of the land as judge was one thing, but what archaeologists found in a canyon in 1969 revealed an even more profound and unsettling motivation for this practice. One where the victim didn't just accept their fate, they willingly volunteered for it. In 1969, within the Canyon de Chelly, archaeologists uncovered a set of remains that told a completely different story. This was a woman from the ancestral Pueblo people, dating back to a period of severe and prolonged drought. The evidence pointed not to a criminal, but to a volunteer. There were no marks of restraint or struggle on her bones. Analysis of her stomach contents revealed she had fasted for about 3 weeks, consuming only water and specific herbs. These herbs matched descriptions in Hopi oral traditions of plants used to prepare a person's spirit for a sacred journey. She was not a prisoner. She was a willing participant in a desperate ritual to end the drought and save her people, becoming a bridge to the spirit world. This was a sacred contract. But not all such burials were acts of devotion. In the wake of the Spanish incursion into the Americas, this practice would be twisted into a weapon of ultimate revenge against a crime the tribe considered unforgivable. A Spanish scribe traveling with conquistadors in 1583 documented a chilling case of a tribal leader's wife who was caught sharing secrets with the Spanish. When her people discovered her betrayal, they designed a punishment of total erasure. Archaeological evidence from a site discovered in 1982 tells a grim story. Her wrists showed deep marks from rawhide restraints that had been soaked before being tied. As the strips dried in the heat, they shrank, cutting deeper into her flesh. The burial site was strategically chosen miles from any water source. But the most horrifying detail was the presence of yucca fiber around her eye sockets. Her eyes had been sewn open, forced to stare into the desert sun until her eyes dried out, and positioned facing away from her homeland. This was more than an execution. It was a spiritual annihilation, an attempt to ensure her soul would never find its way home. But the story of this practice was destined to end not with a traitor, but with an innocent, and her suffering would be used as a political weapon. We now return to the 8-year-old San Carlos Apache girl from 1892. Her story is perhaps the most tragic. She was accused of witchcraft, likely a scapegoat for infant deaths that modern science would attribute to diseases like measles. The tribal council's decision was not for execution, but for purification. Their intention was to bury her for a period of 24 hours. The belief was that this exposure would break the supernatural curse they blamed her for. This shortened time frame was specifically designed to be a survivable ordeal. If she lived, her guilt would be considered purged and she could return to the community. But a catastrophic miscommunication would turn a ritual of purification into a death sentence. The rescue party was delayed, and when they finally found her, they discovered a horror that even they were not prepared for. The rescue party arrived not after 24 hours, but after a devastating 62 hours. The federal agent's report described a scene of unimaginable horror. The girl was still conscious but could no longer respond. Her skin, particularly on her face and neck, had taken on a leather-like quality. Rushed to an agency hospital, she survived for 6 more days under a doctor's care. His notes reveal the medical nightmare her body had endured. The diatomaceous sand had pulled so much moisture that her subcutaneous tissue had begun to dry out. Her mouth, throat, and nasal passages were permanently damaged, and her kidneys were failing. The most haunting detail came from the doctor, who recorded that in her persistent delirium, she muttered that she was tasting sand. This phrase proves that even in her dying state, her brain was still processing the relentless sensory torture of her ordeal. She had, in the most literal sense, begun to mummify while her heart was still beating. Her tragic death, however, would not be the end of her story. It would become the perfect excuse for the U.S. government to launch a devastating blow against tribal sovereignty. The girl's death provided federal authorities with the powerful justification they had been seeking. Within months, the U.S. government used this tragic incident to dramatically expand the Indian Offenses Act. This law was used to strip the San Carlos Apache and other tribes of their right to self-governance, specifically banning their traditional judicial practices. Federal courts took over completely. This forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Were the federal agents who found the girl acting as rescuers, or was her profound suffering strategically exploited as a pretext to destroy tribal sovereignty and impose control? And in a final, profound indignity, the girl's body itself was taken from her people, becoming a numbered specimen in a Washington, D.C. museum for over a century. The story does not end in the museum's collection. In the modern era, the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, began to correct these historical wrongs. This law forced museums to return culturally significant remains and artifacts to tribal nations. Because of this, in 2003, the little girl's remains were finally returned to the San Carlos Apache people. After 111 years, she was given a proper and respectful burial by her community. However, her case is just one of many. The remains of other individuals who died in desert burials are still held in institutions, and their repatriation is the subject of ongoing legal and ethical battles today. This leaves us with one of history's most uncomfortable legacies, forcing us to ask a question with no easy answer. We have seen this practice in three starkly different lights: as a form of judicial exile where the desert decided fate, as a voluntary spiritual sacrifice for the greater good, and as a brutal punishment designed to erase a traitor. These stories force us to confront a modern dilemma that is still unresolved. On one side, museums and scientists argue that preserving such remains is crucial for historical study and education. On the other, tribal nations assert their right to lay their ancestors to rest and reclaim their cultural heritage. So, where do we draw the line? Who truly has the right to these stories and the remains that tell them? I want you to think about this complex question. There is no simple right or wrong, so I ask you to share your honest thoughts in the comments below. And while this difficult history continues to be debated, we can at least acknowledge one quiet resolution. The 8-year-old girl, whose name is kept private out of respect for her descendants, has finally been laid to rest.